By sunrise in 1942, somewhere deep in the pine barrens of Florida, the red-tick hound walked back into camp on his own, tail low, eyes white-rimmed in the last flicker of firelight. Coat clean, but the smell all wrong, like burnt metal and cold, wet earth mixed with something the men could not name and did not want to breathe in too deep. The collar still hung warm around his neck, even though the sand under his forepaws held a thin crust of frost that crunched when you stepped on it. And the men standing there with their rifles lowered and their breath rising white and slow in the December air knew without saying it out loud that something had followed that dog home through 3 nights of winter flatwoods and Blackwater country, because no animal runs that long in cold this deep and comes back with warmth still sitting against. His fur like a living hand had just let go. They called the dog Buck. He belonged to a man named Hollis Kern, 41 years old, steady as cut oak, barrel-chested, with hands scarred from 20 years of handling cable and saw blade. Hollis was the kind of man who worked alone in the dark before dawn and never came back rattled or talking foolish about things he could not explain. He ran deer drives solo most of the time, walking the old tram roads that cut straight and narrow through the barrens west of a lumber camp, whose name no one alive today can remember, just its smoke rising black against the longleaf pines and the diesel rig grinding day and night through cord after cord of timber stacked 8 feet high beside the loading platform. His wife Sarah, a small woman with careful hands, packed his knapsack every Sunday night with the same care she had shown for 20 years of marriage. 2 tins of beans, a wax paper sleeve of biscuits, a tin cup with a dented handle, 3 wooden matches wrapped tight in oilcloth, and a wool blanket that still smelled faintly like their porch in Ocala, where she aired it every other week. His daughter Eunice, 9 years old and small for her age, dark-haired like her mother, was the last person to pet Buck before Hollis clipped the braided leather lead to his collar and walked him south toward the edge of the flatwoods on the cold, gray afternoon of December 19, 1942. 3 days before the hound came back alone, and 4 days before anyone found the collar lying damp and impossibly warm on frosted pine needles under a long-leaf pine with no boot prints, no paw prints, no sign of disturbance anywhere within 30 feet of it. The hunting camp sat low in a sandy hollow cupped between 2 of the old tram roads, close enough to the Blackwater sloughs that you could hear the water moving slow and thick at night, when the wind dropped to nothing and the pines went still and you could hear your own heartbeat in your ears. Men from the mill worked the deer drives in pairs, sometimes 3s, pushing the animals north through the scrub toward the waiting shooters stationed along the open ridgeline, where the palmetto thinned out and the wiregrass grew knee-high and yellow. It was a cold winter that year, the coldest most of the older men could remember in Florida, and the mornings came in sharp and mean, with a thin crust of white frost on the palmetto fans, and a taste like rust or old iron nails sitting permanent in the back of your throat that would not go away, no matter how much bitter coffee you drank by the fire. The nights came early. By 4:30 the light was already leaking out of the sky like water through cracked wood, and by 5 the flatwoods were black as the inside of a mine except for the cook fire and the 3 kerosene lanterns hanging from low branches near the canvas tents. Hollis had Buck on a braided leather lead, the good one with the brass clip, when he walked out slow at dusk on the 19th. The whip-poor wills were already calling, dozens of them, more than Cleet Ferris could remember hearing in one evening, their voices rising and falling in overlapping waves that seemed to come from every direction at once and from no direction you could point to. Cleet, a man of 35 who worked the saw line at the mill 6 days a week and had known Hollis since they were both young and breaking timber together in the panhandle, said later that Hollis waved once with his free hand from the edge of the clearing where the packed sand met the first low wall of scrub, and then the flatwoods swallowed him whole. All that gray-green tangle of saw palmetto and gallberry, and thick needle carpet going silent in the space of 3 heartbeats the way it does when something large moves through and every other living thing holds its breath and waits. Buck came back 3 nights later, December 22nd, just after 4 in the morning, the sky still flat black overhead. No moon showing. No stars visible through the low cloud cover that had settled in the evening before. Cleet Ferris was the one who saw him first, standing perfectly rigid just past the farthest glow of the dying cook fire, his whole body shaking so hard and so fast that his metal tags rattled against each other, like someone was shaking a tin can full of rusty nails. The dog would not come closer. He would not let any man touch him or even approach within arm's length without baring his teeth and backing away. His ears stayed pinned flat against his skull, and his eyes, wide and wet and unblinking, stayed locked hard on the palmetto line to the south, the exact same direction Hollis had taken him 72 hours before. Cleet crouched low on his heels and called soft and gentle, the way you do with a spooked horse or a dog that has seen something it cannot forget and will never be right again. But Buck backed up exactly 3 measured steps through the sand and sat down hard, haunches rigid, still staring at the scrub, still shaking. When Cleet stood up slow and turned to wake the others sleeping in the tents, Buck whined once, high and thin and broken in the middle, like a puppy hearing thunder split the sky open for the first time in its short life. By first light, 6 men were standing in a loose, uneven half-circle around that dog, none of them close enough to reach out and touch him, all of them watching the way his eyes never once left the dark tree line to the south. Someone, a man named Tibbs, poured water into a dented tin dish and slid it carefully across the sand with the steel toe of his work boot. Buck did not even glance down at it. Someone else, the youngest of the group, cracked open a can of potted meat with the tip of a folding knife and scraped the gray, greasy paste onto a flat piece of pine bark and pushed it forward. Buck did not move a muscle. His front legs carried shallow scratches running parallel down the outside. Nothing deep or actively bleeding. Just the kind of scrape you collect pushing hard and fast through dense saw palmetto fronds and wild green briar for hours on end without stopping. But his pads were clean. No dried mud caked thick between the toes. No cockleburs stuck deep in the fur. No blood. No thorn tips embedded in the hard callus. And his collar, when Cleet finally got close enough to reach out slow and touch it with 2 careful fingers while the others watched, was damp to the touch and warm, noticeably warmer than any living body heat, like it had been sitting close beside a wood stove or laid flat on sun-baked metal in July, even though the air that morning had dropped low enough to leave a paper-thin skim of new ice in the water pail by the cook tent and frost standing white and stiff on every visible pine needle within 100 yards. They tried to lead Buck back south toward the spot where Hollis had entered the flatwoods 72 hours before. The dog planted all 4 legs deep in the loose sand and pulled backward with everything he had until the new rope went bar-tight and began to creak and his breathing came in shallow, frantic gulps and white foam began to show thick at both corners of his mouth. One man, younger than the others and not originally from Florida, tried to lift the dog bodily off the ground and carry him. Buck twisted hard in his arms and snapped fast, his teeth clicking shut exactly 1 inch from the man's right wrist, and after that no one tried to force him again. They let the rope fall slack in the sand. By noon that same day, Buck was gone. One man, standing watch near the southern edge of camp, swore on his mother's Bible that he saw the hound trot south along the packed dirt of the eastern tram road, head carried low and tail tucked tight, moving faster than seemed natural or healthy for any animal that had refused both food and water for 6 solid hours. Another man, Tibbs, said he had clearly seen the dog circle the entire camp not once but twice in the hour just before dawn, while the others slept, walking a wide, deliberate ring just outside the farthest reach of the firelight. But when 3 of them walked that same circle together in full daylight to check the sand where the dog should have passed and left clear tracks, there were no paw prints visible at all. Only a faint, shallow pattern pressed into the melting frost that looked to all. 3 of them, like something with soft, heavy pads, had walked there in the dark, circling slow and deliberate, and then stopped completely dead in a spot where the loose sand should have held a clean, clear mark, but showed nothing but smooth, undisturbed ground. Men in Florida still will not talk much about what happened out in those pine barrens during the hard winter of 1942. Some of the old hands who worked the lumber camps and walked the tram roads during the war years, the ones still alive today and still living within a day's drive of the Gulf Coast, will tell the younger mill crews in low voices over coffee that you do not push a solo night drive past the Blackwater Slough when the whip-poor wills start calling, before the last light is fully gone from the sky, and you never, ever let your hound slip the lead or wander loose once the frost begins to settle cold and white on the palmettos after full dark. Nobody saw Hollis Kern after dusk on December 19, 1942. That fact stood solid and unchangeable from the beginning. Cleet Ferris watched him disappear into the palmetto scrub at roughly 5:15 by his pocket watch, with Buck pulling eager and strong on the braided leather lead, and the whip-poor wills already calling thick and relentless in the darkening flat woods, more of them calling at once than Cleet could ever remember hearing before in 20 years. By 6:30, full dark had settled heavy over the barrens, and the temperature had dropped fast enough that the men sitting around the camp cook fire pulled their wool coats tight and moved their chairs closer to the flames. By 7 o'clock, Hollis should have been back. He always came back by 7 when he worked a short evening push. His routine never varied. By 8, Cleet walked 50 yards south down the packed dirt of the tram road with a kerosene lantern held high and called Hollis's name 4 separate times into the blackness. Nothing came back but silence and the distant sound of dark water moving slow through the unseen sloughs. By 9 that first night, 3 men were standing at the southern edge of camp arguing in low, tense voices about whether to go in after him in darkness or wait for morning light when they could see the ground and move without breaking an ankle. Tibbs, the oldest at 53, said, "Flat out, you do not walk the deep barrens at night with only lanterns, not in December when the air is cold enough to kill, and the Blackwater sloughs run 6 feet deep between pine islands with no warning." Cleet said Hollis might be hurt somewhere close, might have stepped wrong and broken an ankle, might be lying out there in the cold waiting for help that was not coming. A third man, older even than Tibbs, with a gray beard and hands like weathered wood, said quietly that Hollis knew those flat woods better than any man alive in 3 counties, and if he was not back yet, it was because he could not come back, and they would do him no favors getting lost themselves in the dark. They waited. All night the fire burned high and no one slept much. Twice, maybe 3 times, someone thought they heard a dog bark far off to the south, faint and directionless, but the sound was so faint and the wind was moving through the pines, and no one could swear it was Buck. At first light on December 20th, 6 men walked out in a loose line, spacing themselves 10 feet apart, moving south from camp along the path Hollis had taken. They carried rifles, coiled rope, a canvas stretcher, 2 coils of bright red cloth strips to tie on branches so they could mark their way back. The sand near camp still showed Hollis's boot prints clear and deep, size 11 work boots with a worn left heel that Cleet recognized immediately, and beside them Buck's 4-pad prints moving fast, nails digging hard into the sand. 50 yards into the scrub, the prints continued clean and easy to follow. At 100 yards, where the palmetto thickened into a low, dense wall and the ground turned softer with old leaf rot, the prints were still there but harder to read. At 200 yards, near a stand of young longleaf pine and a shallow depression that might have been an old sinkhole filled with decades of pine needles, the prints stopped cold, not faded, not blown over, stopped. Hollis's left boot had come down clear and firm in a patch of damp gray sand just before the depression. The print was perfect, every tread line visible in the morning light, the worn left heel obvious. But there was no right boot print following it, no second step, no sign he had stumbled forward or fallen sideways or caught himself on a tree. No disturbance at all in the thick blanket of pine needles beyond that last print. No drag marks. The dog's print stopped in exactly the same place, mid-stride, front paws down and rear paws simply gone, as if both man and animal had been lifted straight up off the ground and ceased to exist. Cleet crouched low and ran his rough hand slowly over the sand and needle carpet for 10 minutes, face close to the ground, looking for anything his eyes might have missed. He found nothing. The other 5 men spread out in a wider circle, checking every inch within 50 feet. One found a shallow scrape on a palmetto trunk, shoulder height, that could have been made by a rifle barrel or a boot heel or a deer rubbing velvet, but it could just as easily have been there for months. That was all they found. They pushed deeper anyway, calling Hollis's name every few minutes, stopping every 100 feet to listen. The flatwoods swallowed their voices. No echo came back. No birds moved. By noon they had covered more than a mile in every direction from where the tracks ended, tying red cloth strips to branches every 50 yards, marking paths they had walked. They found nothing. No torn fabric on thorns, no blood on sand or bark, no rifle, no knapsack, no tin cup, no wool blanket, no sign of struggle or any human presence beyond that one last boot print, sitting alone in the damp sand like a signature on an empty page. By mid-afternoon on December 20th, 2 more men arrived from the mill with 3 younger hounds trained for tracking. They brought the dogs to where the prints stopped and let them smell the ground long and slow. The hounds circled twice. Then all three locked onto the same scent line heading southwest toward the densest part of the barrens where the sloughs ran close together and the ground turned treacherous. The men followed close behind. For a quarter mile, the dogs pulled hard and confident. Then, without warning, all three stopped dead at the same moment, ears flat, and refused to go forward. One sat down hard and began to whine high and continuous. Another turned 3 tight circles and lay flat on its belly. The third backed up until it bumped the handler's legs and would not move even when pulled. The men tried for 20 minutes to coax them forward. It did not work. They tried dragging them. One hound twisted free of its collar and bolted back toward camp at full speed. After that, they let the other 2 go and followed them back, none of them speaking. That night, December 20th, the men sat close around the fire and no one spoke much or ate much. Someone said they should bring in the county sheriff. Someone else said the sheriff was 60 miles away and would take 2 days to arrive, and what was he going to find that 8 men and 5 dogs had not found? Tibbs said quietly that maybe Hollis had kept walking, gotten turned around in the dark and gone west instead of north. Was out there cold and hungry, but alive. Cleet said nothing. He sat with his back against a pine and stared at the coals without blinking. Just after midnight, one of the men on watch near the southern edge, a man named Purvis, heard something that made him go still. He described it later as 2 notes, low and short, exactly like the cattle whistle Hollis used when he wanted Buck to circle wide. The sound came from the south, maybe 200 yards into the scrub. Purvis called for Cleet. By the time Cleet reached him, the sound was gone. They stood and listened for 10 minutes. Nothing. But 20 minutes later, another man on the opposite side of camp said he heard the same sound coming from behind him to the north. That made no sense at all. No man could cover that distance through dense scrub and pitch darkness without noise the whole camp would hear. The 2 men met at the fire and described what they had heard. The notes were identical. Short, low, 2-tone, exactly the whistle Hollis had used for 20 years. Neither man wanted to say what they were thinking, but everyone sitting around that fire heard it in the silence anyway. By December 21st, word had spread through the barrens and beyond. 12 more men arrived from the mill and from scattered homesteads, some bringing dogs, others carrying long wooden poles to probe soft ground near the sloughs in case Hollis had fallen through into deep water and gotten trapped under a submerged root mat. They organized a proper grid search, walking shoulder to shoulder, calling every 30 seconds, marking every path with cloth strips that by midday hung from hundreds of branches like strange pale fruit. They searched without stopping until the light died. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no gear, no trace of Hollis Kern anywhere in those flat woods. That was the night Buck came back, December 22nd, just after 4 in the morning, shaking so violently his tags rattled and his eyes wild and white-rimmed with that warm, damp collar around his neck and frost crunching under his clean paws. When Cleet finally got close enough to touch that collar, close enough to feel the impossible warmth against his fingertips like it had just come off a living neck, he said years later that he understood in that moment that whatever had taken Hollis out of the flat woods had sent the dog back as a message, and the message was simple: do not follow. Old hands in Florida, the ones who worked those timber camps during the war, still tell younger men that when a hound comes back wrong like that, shaking and staring at nothing you can see, you let it go. You do not follow it. You do not try to retrace its steps. And you do not go back into the barrens after dark looking for the man who did not come home, because the barrens do not give back what they take, and sometimes they send something else back in its place just to prove they can. The search became something else after Buck came back. It stopped being about finding Hollis alive and started being about proving what everyone already knew, but could not say out loud. By December 23rd, more than 30 men were working the barrens in rotating shifts, some walking grid patterns through the scrub, others dragging grappling hooks through the shallow edges of the sloughs, a few standing watch at fixed points with rifles and notebooks, writing down every sound they heard and every hour it happened. They tied so many cloth strips to branches that parts of the flatwoods looked like a strange forest grown from red and white rags instead of leaves. They found nothing that helped, but they found things that made it worse. On the morning of December 24th, a man named Dalton, walking a marked grid line 2 miles south of camp, found a second leather dog collar lying flat on a bed of pine needles under a young longleaf. The collar was identical to the one Buck had been wearing when he came back. Same width, same brass fittings, same maker's stamp on the inside. Dalton called for Cleet. When Cleet arrived and crouched down to examine it without touching it, his face went white. He recognized it immediately because he had helped Hollis braid that collar himself 4 years earlier from 3 strips of tanned cowhide in Hollis's workshed behind his house in Ocala. There was no mistaking it, but Buck's collar was still back at camp, hanging from a tent pole where Cleet had placed it himself after the dog disappeared again. This was a second collar, identical in every detail, lying 2 miles from where the dog had returned. They brought both collars back to camp and laid them side by side on a flat piece of board. Every man who looked at them agreed they were the same collar, or so close it made no difference. Same wear pattern on the buckle, same faint staining on the leather from years of sweat and rain, same small tear near the third hole where Buck had pulled hard against a fence post once and nearly gotten loose. But there were 2 of them, and no one could explain that. Tibbs said maybe Hollis had made 2 collars, kept one as a spare. Cleet said Hollis never did anything twice when once was enough, and besides, the wear patterns matched too perfectly for these to be separate objects used at different times. Someone suggested one of them might be a fake, placed there deliberately to confuse the search. No one responded to that because the alternative was worse, and they all knew it. That same afternoon, December 24th, 2 men checking a section of tram road a mile west of camp found boot prints in a patch of soft sand between the rails. The prints were fresh, made within the last few hours based on how sharp the edges were. They matched Hollis's boots exactly, size 11 with the worn left heel, but the prints were facing the wrong direction. They showed a man walking backward, heel striking first, then the ball of the foot pressing down as weight shifted in reverse. The prints continued for 30 feet in a perfectly straight line, then stopped in the middle of the roadbed with no explanation. No forward prints, no sign he had turned around. Just 30 feet of a man walking backward through sand, and then nothing. Cleet walked that section of road 3 times, measuring the stride length, checking the depth of each print. They were consistent. They were deliberate. Someone had walked backward down that tram road in full daylight on Christmas Eve 1942, wearing Hollis Kearns boots, and then had simply stopped existing in the middle of a straight, empty stretch of packed sand with visibility for 100 yards in both directions. One of the younger men said maybe someone was playing a cruel joke, trying to scare them or make them give up the search. Tibbs asked him how you walk backward for 30 feet in soft sand without turning around once to see where you were going, and the young man had no answer for that. By Christmas Day, the search had taken on a ritual quality that had nothing to do with finding anyone alive. Men showed up at dawn, walked their assigned sections in silence, tied their cloth markers and left before dark without speaking much to each other. Families back in the settlements and at the mill had started asking when the men were coming home. Some of the younger workers had already left, saying they had responsibilities they could not ignore any longer. But the core group, the ones who had known Hollis personally or had worked with him for years, stayed. They stayed because leaving felt like an admission of something they could not name. On December 26th, a man checking the southern slough line found something that stopped the search cold for 2 full hours. Wedged into the fork of a small cypress tree growing at the water's edge was a folded piece of paper, dry and clean despite being less than 3 feet from the surface of the black water. The paper was a page torn from a small notebook, the kind Hollis carried in his shirt pocket to mark cattle counts and fence repairs. The handwriting on it was Hollis's handwriting, confirmed by 3 men who had seen his script 100 times on work logs and supply requests. The message was short. It said, "Check the east fence line past the burnt pine. Something wrong with the wire there." The east fence line past the burnt pine was a section of barbed wire fence that marked the boundary between the hunting grounds and a large private ranch to the east. Everyone knew the burnt pine, a lightning-struck longleaf that stood black and dead on a small rise. The wire there had been checked on December 21st as part of the grid search. It had been fine. They checked it again on December 26th after finding the note. The wire was still fine. No breaks, no damage. Nothing wrong with it at all. But the note was real, written in Hollis's hand on paper from his notebook, found 4 days after Hollis had walked into the Flatwoods, and 7 days after he was last seen alive. Cleet read that note 5 times standing beside the slough in the cold afternoon light. He read it out loud to the other men. He checked the handwriting against an old supply list they had back at camp that Hollis had written 3 weeks earlier. It matched. The paper matched. Even the pencil matched. The same soft graphite Hollis preferred because it did not break in his pocket when he crouched down to work. Someone asked if Hollis could have written the note before he disappeared and hidden it there for some reason. Cleet pointed out that the paper was clean and dry, not weathered, and it had been raining off and on for a week. If the note had been there since December 19th, it would show water damage. It did not. Someone else asked if maybe Hollis had survived somehow, was hiding in the barrens for reasons no one understood, and had left the note as a signal. No one wanted to follow that thought to its conclusion, because if Hollis was alive and hiding, what was he hiding from? They placed the note in a small metal box and brought it back to camp. That night, sitting around the fire, men began to speak more openly about things they had been holding back. One admitted he had heard footsteps circling his tent 2 nights earlier, but found no prints in the morning. Another said he had seen a light moving through the trees to the south around 3 in the morning on December 23rd, a single steady light like a lantern carried at walking height. But when he woke the others and they went to investigate, there was nothing there and no sign anyone had passed through. A third man said his dog, which he had brought from home to help with the search, had refused to enter the tent on Christmas night and had spent the entire night sitting rigid outside the tent flap, staring south toward the palmetto line, growling low in its chest. Tibbs said quietly that in his 53 years in Florida, he had seen men disappear before. Men who worked alone, men who took risks, men who got careless or unlucky. But he had never seen anything like this. He said the thing that frightened him most was not that Hollis was gone, but that something was still trying to communicate, still leaving signs, still moving through the barrens wearing his boots and using his handwriting and carrying his habits. He said it felt like something was learning how to be Hollis Kern, and every day it got a little better at it, and he did not know what would happen when it finally got it right. No one responded to that. They sat in silence and watched the fire burn low. By December 27th, the official search was called off. The men packed their gear, folded their tents, and walked back out along the tram roads toward the mill and the settlements beyond. They left the cloth strips tied to the branches. For years after, people walking through those barrens would find them, faded and torn, marking paths that led nowhere, and searches that found nothing but questions. The 2 collars were kept in a wooden box in the mill office for a decade. Workers who saw them said they looked identical even after years of sitting still, and that sometimes on cold mornings you could touch them, and one would be warmer than the other, though which one changed. The note was kept by Cleet Ferris until he died in 1960. His daughter found it in his desk, and burned it unread because her father had told her years before that some things written down should not be kept. People in Florida still do not talk much about the Hollis Kern case. The old lumber camp is long gone, the tram roads overgrown, the sloughs quieter now than they were in 1942. But people who live near those barrens, people whose families worked that country during the war, still follow certain rules without explaining why. You do not walk the deep flatwoods alone after dark, not past the slough line. You do not answer a whistle you hear in the scrub unless you can see who made it. If you find something that should not be there, something too clean or too warm or in 2 places at once, you leave it where it is, and you walk away without looking back. And if your dog ever comes home shaking and will not let you touch it and stares at nothing you can see, you let that dog go wherever it wants to go because it has seen something you do not want to meet, and it is trying to tell you the only way it knows how. 80 years have passed since Hollis Kern walked into the Florida barrens and did not come back. The lumber camp is gone now, reclaimed by palmetto and pine. The tram roads are barely visible under decades of needle fall and new growth. The Blackwater sloughs still run dark and slow between the pine islands, and the whip-poor-wills still call at dusk. But fewer people hear them now because fewer people go that deep into the flatwoods, especially alone, especially after dark. Sarah Kern waited 6 months before she accepted that her husband was not coming home. She never remarried. She raised Eunice alone in Ocala, working as a seamstress, and she never spoke publicly about what happened in December 1942. But people who knew her said she would not allow anyone in her house to whistle, not even the simple two-note cattle call that Hollis had used in the field. If someone forgot and whistled while working in her yard or delivering goods to her door, she would go pale and ask them to leave. Eunice left Florida in 1955 and never returned. In an interview decades later, she said she remembered her father as a kind man who smelled like pine smoke and leather, and she remembered Buck as a good dog, who loved her father completely. She said she did not remember much about the winter he disappeared, but she was lying. Everyone who knew her said she was lying. Clete Ferris stayed in Florida until he died in 1960. He never worked the deep barrens again. He took a job at the mill running the saw line, indoor work, and he never hunted after 1942. People said he aged 20 years in the 6 months following the search. His hands shook when he drank coffee. He startled at sudden sounds. He would not go outside after sunset unless someone went with him, and even then he would not go far from the light of the house. In 1958, a journalist from a regional paper came to interview him about the Kern disappearance. Clete agreed to talk, but only in daylight, only inside his house, only if the journalist promised not to use his full name in the article. He told the journalist about the search, about the boot prints that stopped, about the 2 collars, about the note. He did not tell him about the whistle heard in 2 places at once. He did not tell him about the warm collar, or the way Buck had stared at the palmetto line like something was standing there breathing just beyond the firelight. When the journalist asked him directly what he thought had happened to Hollis Kern, Clete was silent for nearly a minute. Then he said, "Something took him. Something that knew how to use his things. Something that is still out there learning." The journalist asked what he meant by learning. Clete said, "Learning how to be him, learning how to be us." That part of the interview was not included in the published article. The area where Hollis disappeared was logged heavily in the late 1950s. The timber company that owned the land brought in crews and equipment and cleared thousands of acres of pine. Workers on those crews reported strange occurrences, tools that went missing and reappeared in places already searched. Boot prints found in sections of forest where no one had been assigned to work. A foreman's whistle that blew twice on its own one morning, sitting on a stump with no wind and no one within 50 yards. One crew refused to work past 3 in the afternoon during the winter months. When the company supervisor demanded an explanation, the crew boss said only that the older men had warned them not to be in that part of the barrens after the light started failing, and he was not going to risk his men to meet a deadline. The supervisor threatened to fire the entire crew. The crew boss said that was fine. They would find other work. The supervisor backed down. The crew worked half days until the spring, and no one questioned it again. In 1963, a team of college students studying wildlife patterns camped for 3 nights in the barrens near where the old tram roads used to run. On the second night, they reported hearing a dog barking in the distance, moving in a circle around their camp, but never coming close enough to see. On the third night, one of the students went out alone to check a motion sensor camera they had set up near a game trail. He came back to camp 20 minutes later, pale and shaking, and insisted they pack up and leave immediately, even though it was after midnight. He would not explain why. The group packed in silence and hiked out by flashlight. Years later, in a letter to a researcher compiling folklore from rural Florida, that student wrote, "I saw boot prints in the sand leading up to our camera. They were fresh. I could see where the heel had pressed deeper on the left side, like the person had a limp or uneven wear. But there were no prints leading away. Just toward the camera, stopping 3 feet from it, pointing at it. And the camera had taken a photo at the exact time I was walking toward it. When we developed the film weeks later, the photo showed nothing, just trees and darkness. But something had stood there and tripped the sensor, and whatever it was had boots on." By the 1970s, the story of Hollis Kern had faded from public memory. It was not dramatic enough for television, not clean enough for a simple headline. There was no body, no confession, no trial, no resolution. It became a local story, the kind passed quietly between families who had lived in the area for generations. The kind you heard at fish fries and church socials when someone new moved into the area and asked why nobody hunted past a certain fence line or why the old logging roads were left to grow over instead of being maintained for recreation. The story changed slightly with each telling, but certain details never changed. The dog coming back wrong, the collar still warm, the backward boot prints, the note in Hollis's handwriting found days after he vanished. Those details stayed consistent because they were the details that mattered. The ones that proved this was not a simple case of a man getting lost or hurt or running away. In 1989, the state of Florida purchased a large section of the barrens and designated it as protected wilderness. Hunting was prohibited. Camping required permits. Rangers patrolled the area sporadically, mostly checking for illegal fires or poaching. In the winter of 1991, a ranger named Kostecki was doing a routine patrol on foot along one of the old overgrown tram roads when he found a dog collar lying in the middle of the path. The collar was old, leather, with brass fittings that had turned green with age. He picked it up and brought it back to the ranger station, thinking it might belong to someone's lost pet. When he showed it to an older ranger who had worked the area for 30 years, the man looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he told Kostecki to put it back exactly where he found it and not to handle it again. Kostecki asked why. The older ranger said, "Because it has been found before, more than once, and it always comes back." Kostecki thought the man was joking. He was not joking. Kostecki put the collar back. A week later, another ranger found it in a completely different section of the barrens, miles from where Kostecki had found it, lying clean and dry on wet ground after 2 days of rain. People in Florida, especially people whose grandparents worked the lumber camps or farmed the edges of the barrens during the war years, still follow rules that no one writes down and most will not explain. If you hunt those woods, you do it in pairs, never alone, and you are back at your truck before the sun drops below the tree line. If your dog stops and will not go forward, you stop too, and you turn around, and you do not ask why out loud. If you find something in the woods that is too clean, too warm, too perfectly placed, you do not touch it and you do not take it with you. If you hear a whistle or a voice calling your name from deeper in the scrub, you do not answer and you do not go to investigate because the thing calling might sound exactly like someone you know, and it might use exactly the words that person would use, but it is not that person, and it has not been that person for a very long time. There are 3 versions of what happened to Hollis Kern in the winter of 1942. The first version is that he had an accident, fell into a slough or sinkhole, and his body was never recovered because the barrens are vast, and the water is deep, and things disappear into black mud that never gives them back. The second version is that he walked away deliberately, left his life behind for reasons no one understood, and the signs left after were either coincidence or the result of people wanting to see patterns in randomness. The third version is the one nobody in Florida says out loud unless they have lived there long enough to understand why the rules exist. The third version is that something in those barrens took Hollis Kern in December 1942. Something that moves through the flat woods, learning the shapes of men, and that Buck came back because the dog got away before whatever took Hollis could finish with him, and that the collar was warm because something had been wearing it, and that the boot prints walked backward because whatever made them does not move the way living men move, and that the note was real because whatever took Hollis had learned his handwriting the same way it learned his whistle and his walk, and the weight of his boots in sand. Which version makes sense here? In a wilderness that has swallowed men before and will swallow them again. In flat woods where dogs still refuse to go and rangers still find things that should not exist. In a place where the rules have been followed for 80 years by people who will not explain why they follow them, but who have never once broken them. Which version do people in Florida believe when they tell their children not to whistle in the deep woods, not to answer voices they cannot see, not to go back for something they dropped if it means walking alone into scrub after the light fails? And which version are they afraid to say out loud because saying it makes it real in a way that silence does not? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.